Hello, my name is Monty Webb, and we're going to discuss today DNA and how it may help in some theories about the Webb family tree. Follow the blue marker on the left and see that it is passed on father to son. Now let's just take a look here. This is the blue marker I'm talking about, the Y chromosome. And if this is me, here's my Y chromosome. Even though my other chromosomes continually change by generation and generation, my Y chromosome is identical to my father's, identical to my grandfather's, identical to my great-grandfather. It would never change all the way back to Adam, and we would all have the exact same Y chromosome, all men on Earth, if it weren't for some random mutations. Don't worry about the word mutations. It doesn't mean that somehow our DNA got hit with an alpha particle flying through space and we grew an extra finger. We're talking about a very simple part of the DNA molecule where little parts of it that are supposed to be repeated a certain number of steps. For example, a little short term that's repeated for 10 steps might get repeated 11 steps. Once that happens, then all of the males in the line will have 11 steps on that particular node until something happens and it either goes back to 10 or maybe it'll go to 12. So all these different parts of the Y chromosome can mutate over time. And it's the way you can tell if your line is related to some other line, assuming you both have good DNA samples. So DNA is a hint. It's really not a substitute for primary source research, like wills, deeds, birth, and death records, land titles, etc. And by the way, an old book that thinks they have the genealogy because they looked at some of this stuff, but you don't know how much of that they still guessed at because they wanted a nice book and they didn't want to look stupid. And there's a lot of early books on genealogy, particularly on the Webb line, where if you're a Webb within 3 cities, you're going to get connected to another Webb, whether you're really related or not. So these wills, deeds, and birth records still exist for genealogists to go back and look at. And that's where you can make an absolute known path on your ancestors. Well, sometimes we have no paper trail, but if we're lucky, DNA might provide a useful tip. My Webb line runs into a problem. James 1777 has no documentation on which James Webb his father was. All we know is he has a father, James Webb. He was tied to a Webb family from Saybrook, Connecticut, but my great-aunt Irene was very suspicious about where this data came from. She even hired Donald Lyons Jacobus to research the problem. Here we see a summary of the work John Webb of Saybrook, a book by Harrison E. Webb of Summit, New Jersey, and that was published in 1948. And it basically covers what's called the Saybrook Webbs because they were down there where the Connecticut River comes out in Saybrook, Connecticut. And we have the first Webb, John Webb, 1640. All right. And he is in Saybrook. John Webb, 1667, also in Saybrook. Their son, Gideon Webb, his son, James Webb. And then the person I'm interested in is James Webb, 1777. He is in this line. But whereas most of this data has some documentation, there's nothing on why you would put James in this family. If you go look at the record out on Family Search today, well, I'm still alive, so you won't find me. But starting with my dad, Carlisle Farr Webb, you can go up and there's perfect documentation of us all the way up to James Webb 1777. You'll also discover that John Webb 1640 is connected to a John Webb 1627, John Webb 1600, Richard Webb 1580. Absolute baloney, okay? We'll get into that later. So anyway, Donald Lyons Jacobus could not authenticate anything that Harrison did on James Webb 1777. So he asked about the documents to put James in this family. Harrison said, well, it was the best fit, and there was no other data. Baptists are poor record keepers, and so he must have been a Baptist because we can't find any records. Bliss was in Hanover, and his father was named James. And James 1777 said his father was named James. Oh, what luck. They must have been the same James. Now, a mild controversy is that the children that were born in Connecticut to James 1733 were all born in Colchester. Presently, it's Colchester, New London, Connecticut. But back when in 1775, it would have been Colchester, Hartford, Connecticut. But James Webb 1777 church record says he was born in Hartford, Connecticut. Two of his sons also gave Hartford, Connecticut as his birth town. Other researchers have looked at this data and said, well, yeah, but the original record only said Hartford, didn't say anything else, and everyone's trying to guess that it's Hartford, but that may not be accurate. Well, here's Saybrook, where the first Webbs in America on my line entered. And they have places in Saybrook and also up here in East Haddam. Lots of land, lots of different Webbs that are all related in this area, the Saybrook area. When James Webb 1733 goes to Nova Scotia for a few years and then comes back, he's right here in Colchester. Colchester's not too far from East Haddam, and it looks like they traveled back and forth quite a bit. That's not that far to get up to Hartford, but if he really was born in Hartford, then it's suspicious that he wasn't really born in this family at all, because he would have been born down here in Colchester. Others say, well, he was, but they just summarized and said, oh, I was just born in Hartford. So we don't know. The history of James Webb 1733 is well known. No documentation he had of James 1777. When some of the family are not attending church in that East Hampton, Connecticut Baptist church, the Baptist minister sends a letter asking about him. Everybody in the family is mentioned except no James 1777. After the father dies, a detailed will splits up the money and the land between all four kids, but nothing for any James 1777, above from Donald Lyons Jacobus' work. Now, later researchers have gone in there and somehow decided that the will only split it up between three kids, and that Joshua didn't get any land, but the data I have from Donald Lyons Jacobus says Joshua was part of the settlement also. No birth records in Nova Scotia or Connecticut match our James Webb. James Webb 1733 was Baptist. James Webb 1777 was Methodist until he was converted to Mormonism. Born in 1777, with a war going on, and there's Webbs all over the U.S., some from Canada, some from England, some from the colonies. They're all over the place. Did James really have a Webb father that possibly died in the war? Or he went back to England? Or was James simply raised by a Webb family and took the name Webb? They really didn't know, and with no paper trail at all. I was really nervous about it because I can't really prove anything. Was he really a Webb? The first documented information found on James Webb, 1777. At 25 years of age, he married Betsy Fable. First child was born in 1803, Brookfield, New York. 1804, he was still in Brookfield. He had previously owned land in Otsego County, and maybe he lived there for a while, they don't know. When his third child, John, was born, he was of Manheim, Montgomery County, not too far away. It's from here that he sold his second lot that he owned in Otsego. Now, this is actually a pretty good distance from the other Saybrook Webb, so it's a little strange that that's where he first shows up. DNA adds to the Webb information. I joined the Webb surname project and sent in my DNA. I got back a database of information that gets updated, and I get notified whenever anyone gets a close hit to my profile. I used some free software to model the genetic difference between other Webb participants. I had 1 close and 6 fairly close Webb DNA. So yeah, James Webb, 1777, came from a Webb line. What you see here is my first information that had a lot of different Webbs. And instantly I discover a really, really interesting phenomenon. I'm up here. I have a close relative from a Webb line. I have another relative with data back to England. And then a whole bunch of Webbs from Virginia that are close to us. You could say we were kind of the same family, but this is a far enough time apart that they have them as 2 different families in the Webb surname database. And a bunch of Webbs over here, a bunch of different ones here, different. And I'm, lots and lots of different Webbs. So I called this first Webb that's very close, new line number 2, and we'll look at that in a while. And in the English connection, I said, well, that's going to be the UK line 3. And the southern Webbs came from the UK, but they know they came from the UK, but they can't take the jump across to find that first relative in the UK. So in a sense, I'm kind of lucky because there is at least a somewhat close person that has the jump back into the UK. Now this group here are a bunch of different Massachusetts Webb. They're definitely not related to us. Not at all. When you get back this far before you find the branches connecting, it's so far away in time that we're not related at all. There were 39 other Webb lines besides our 2 here that are relatively close. So, and all 39 of them were not related to at all. So I redrew just the webs we're related to here. And I'm going to call this one James X. And he's from a new line we'll look at in a while. Here's the UK line. I've redone it with saying I want a 75% probability that we're related, and that 75% probability, go figure out when we would have been related. What was interesting is this fellow is so close that it would have guessed something like 1730 for us to be related. Well, that's exactly the time frame I'm looking for. The UK line basically has drifted far enough from us that best guess is 1520 when that occurred. And now the southern webs look like they're as far away as like 1280, which is getting suspect if we're really related to them at all, but we don't even care. What we really care about is getting the correct line. Who's next from John 1777 and carry it back a few generations. And this is calculated from first going in here and by looking at each of the parts of the DNA that are different between two people. They can calculate how many years ago that probably happened. And so James X, we're looking at 210 years ago. And William in the UK, 420 years ago. And then some of the different webs in Virginia, they're all over the map, but kind of an average is like 660 years ago. So now here are all the different groups. And we're down here in the William Webb before 1600 in England. That's 1520. Is when that we probably have our English line back to. Except there wasn't enough data. There weren't towns, there wasn't birth dates or anything, just names of people. So very suspicious. It's not really the help you'd think it is, because we don't really have the opportunity to pick up the line in England with a real person and follow it back on our line. And I still count Mary Webb as possible in our group, but boy, that was a long time ago to split that group from ours. All these others you see here, absolutely not related to us. One of the most common places that our line gets connected to, and it's not correct at all, but we've connected to Jonathan Webb, 1675, 1744, Stamford, Connecticut. All right. The problem, Stamford's just a little ways away from the Saybrook area. And so, in my opinion, sloppy researchers go back and they go, oh, hey, they're so close. I'm not stumped anymore. I found some information. And we continually get hooked up to the Jonathan Webb branch. And I'll guarantee you, it's not correct. How can I say it's not correct when I don't have a piece of paper that proves it's not correct? Well, I do have a piece of paper. It's called the DNA. And we'll get into that later. So I've highlighted in red the different groups that from time to time different researchers will hook up to and say, oh, they were in the same town, so it must have been this way, things like that. Similar to what Harrison did by saying, well, if Bliss was his brother, they were in the same town, therefore that's enough data, that's how it fits. And that's not really good enough if you really want to know with accuracy what your line is. So there's a David Webb, a Daniel Webb, and a Christopher Webb. All have been used from time to time as extensions on our line, and we're not related to them at all. This is so long ago, these 39 Webb lines are not related at all. All right. So, in green are the Massachusetts Webbs that we're not related to, and this is what gets stuck all the time. Richard, John. And of course, that means that by the time they get to this John, he's usually John 2 or John 3 or something like that. But the jump from him to this John Webb here is absolutely wrong. There are plenty of Webbs that have their DNA from this group, and that DNA does not match ours at all. The problem is, this wasn't the line that our DNA showed we were in at all. I mean, down here in the Saybrook area. Initial DNA does not show our family in this line anywhere. Either we're not related to this line, or no one in the U.S. from this line has had their DNA tested. So it's not in the database. That's a problem. If people don't get tested and join the Webb Surname Organization, it won't be in the database that searches and makes these connections. It took a few years, but I tracked down a direct descendant of James Webb, 1733, through Joshua Webb, one of his sons. Now, there's plenty of documentation that showed Joshua was the son of James Webb. I convinced him to get his DNA tested, and when the results came back, I compared them here. I'll just tell you what it is. It's hard to see, but my DNA is right here. The DNA from Joshua is here. So close together, it's a high probability. We're very, very closely related. Now, I've put names on some of these other groups to show you the problems. There's a Thomas Webb from Wiltshire, Jonathan Webb, 1675, Stamford, Connecticut. All right. Now, that's such a large family that has already tested their DNA. You get lots and lots of entries. So only a few of them are identical. A lot of them, there's enough generations that there's a spread in what is the DNA for Jonathan Webb, okay? In reality, of the probably around 5 people that have tested that I know are cousins of mine, we've got plus or minus 1 on a few sites already. And then over here is another group that we get connected to from time to time, the Christopher. And again, why are we not related to Jonathan Webb? Well, we go back in time. This is 200 years. 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,002, 1,004, 1,006. No. You see, if you have to go back 1,600 years, you missed the U.S. You missed anything in the colonies. So you have to find that you're connected to them a lot closer than 1,600 years ago. Or the other way to put that is, we're not related, okay? So the DNA results were 36 out of 37 that were tested match with Joshua's line. And I had a 65 out of 67 match with a Charles Irwin Webb group. So that's good matches with both branches, you know. And so there was other calculations I was able to do, and it said there was a 95% chance this James Webb was the son of James Webb 1733, and that's because Joshua, an absolutely known son, his DNA is so close to my DNA. But now we have a bit of a mystery that there's a 94% chance we're connected to a James Webb X, and his birth date will change all the time depending on who gets their hands on the computer. It's unknown, and he claimed he came from England. We'll get into that later. But because the 95 higher than 94, I typically just leave James Webb as connected up. It's not proven. It's just probably correct, so okay. Everybody happy. In the Rufford situation, I could say my second cousins are 210 years away from me, the same that James 1733 and the same as James X. So if they tie as close as second cousins, that's pretty good. Now, it's fairly certain that James Webb was a close relation. And this is on very, very tight calculations. It would show where that 94% chance here and 95% chance here and 94% chance here. But we're probably all related. We just have to figure out how. It's not probably. We are related. We have to figure out how. So I went back to James 1733, studied what I could find about him, and see if there was anything about his life that might give us a clue as to what's going on. There was a very good researcher, Daniel Owen Robinson, and he was a good researcher, digging up wills, records, deeds, and he had quite a bit of data. And you can pause this if you want and read it. I'm not going to read it all to you. I'm just going to go through two small points. The last point will do how. Now, it has James Webb, born in 1777. Well, I got a hold of him, and he says, well, he got that from the book by Harrison E. Webb, who had no real data. Okay, so that's interesting. But some of the other stuff he had from real sources. And he had an interesting story about the French and Indian Wars. To summarize it very quickly, James Webb 1733, he supposedly is a farmer, but he and most of his neighbors all sign up to be in the militia. And the British were fighting the French up in Nova Scotia. Their goal was to drive them out of Nova Scotia, then drive them out of Canada, and then we'll mop up in the colonies. In the meantime, while the heavy fighting is done by British military, we'll get the people in the colony to organize some militias and harass the French from down there. So James and his neighbors, the Welches, and a couple other neighbors, they all pitch in and join the militia. Their first goal was to take a fort in Syracuse, and they were under the impression that there wasn't going to be very many French soldiers there, because the French were all running up into Canada to try to stop the British. Once they knew that they couldn't hold Nova Scotia, but let's at least draw the line in Canada. So supposedly there's not too many French soldiers in the fort. If we sneak up on it, we'll get them easy. Well, they made so much noise that the Indians heard them, the Indians that were helping the French in this war, The Indians were waiting in ambush in the forest that you had to go through before you got to the fort. When the Indians attacked, the best move that they could come up with was to turn and run home. And that's why most of them were saved. They just went home. And the town goes, wow, you didn't have to fight too long. Well, it's planting season. We got to get back and plant our crops, blah, blah, blah. And they did that next year, a different fort, same kind of a story. The fort had way more French soldiers than theoretically would have been there. They made too much noise. They didn't really surprise the fort. When they were in view, the fort fired at them, and they all turned around and ran home again. And James got paid for that. So it was not too bad work. If you were in the back of the line, you were last to get hit from the French, and you were first home. So don't know where he was, but anyway. But the question comes up, how do you leave your farm twice, 2 years in a row, with nobody to watch it? And people were not that honest, I guarantee you. Your plow, your horses, any good food, that's going to be gone if you don't have somebody. And most people would have what they call a wife to watch things, or they wouldn't have volunteered in the first place. So that's a mystery. Now, this all was about 2008, 2009. In 2014, just, randomly, somebody that got DNA tested and sent their DNA in, I get a 37 out of 37 match with the James WEBB X from England through an Auburn Marshall Webb. 37 out of 37 is closer than some of my second cousins. So what's probably happened is that some years ago we maybe were one away from each other. And then one of those that had hopped from a 10 to an 11 hopped back down to a 10, and all of a sudden we get a perfect match when the DNA from that family wouldn't have necessarily matched every generation. Because you can have the DNA drift up, you can have it drift down. It's the overall score that they use. So I'm excited to a certain extent. But it's probably better to say we're as close as second cousins and somewhat closer than to Joshua. So now there's a 97% chance our James is the son of this James. Still the 95% chance that this James, his father, is this James. So now we put in the new James X with the identical DNA to me. My second cousin, Joshua, whose DNA is supposedly would be the same as James 1733. The other data from the line, and then the data from the UK. I found a interesting bit of information. They were looking at the line of James X here. And Valentine was one of his sons. Valentine had a bunch of kids. One was a Charles Irwin. One of the others was the Auburn Marshall. And so we have DNA from two of the sons of Valentine. But they're not identical. They've had one or two changes over time. And that's what you get out of DNA. But anyway, looking for where there's any information on this guy, there was an article in a book, Pioneers of Northern Pennsylvania. Because it turns out even though James and Valentine were born and lived mostly in the New York area, a lot of Valentine's sons and a lot of the other family all went into Pennsylvania and were prominent. And so the author of the article of the book written in Pennsylvania wants to get all he can on who these guys, and he's interviewing people like Valentine to find out, well, what's your dad, what's your grandpa, and all that. And here's the interesting story. James Webb, the founder of this family in this country, was born in England in the latter part of the 18th century and died in the early part of the 19th century in Chenango County, New York. He immigrated to America as a stowaway when a boy and went to work as a farmhand near Boston, Massachusetts. And it is said that by climbing to the top of a tree, he witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill. That would have been 1775. Later, he married and settled in Chenango County, New York, where he cultivated a farm until his death. He married somebody Hackett, born in Ireland, emigrated with her parents to America, and died in Chenango County. Their children: Leander, a soldier in the War of 1812. Roxana, Wilcox, Abigail, Orson, Valentine, Real, Caroline, and a couple others. So there's no confusion with the kids perfectly named that they're talking about their father being the first Webb that came to America. If you believe him, he said he's a stowaway from England. Okay. Now, this is just a quick summary. All these people don't really show up yet because they didn't join the Webb surname. I know how close they are to me, but I don't have a record of their DNA necessarily unless they join the Webb surname organization. But I don't need Gordon. I don't need his data because he's an exact match. When he's an exact match, I can use my own because that's exactly what an exact match means. You say, well, what the heck? He's got a name that his last name isn't Webb. Well, he was a Webb, but raised by a family for whatever circumstances he told me. But his real name was Webb, and that's why he was doing his DNA to see where he came from. Keith, Max, Douglas Lane, Michael, these are second and third cousins from our line. And they all are interested in how do we get past James 1777, all right? Dennis Darrell Webb is the person that I dug up and knew he was a descendant of Joshua Webb and got him to turn in his DNA. And then Dennis Stephen Webb and Charles H. Webb were the guys that got their DNA early on line 2 data. Cecil Ray Webb's the guy whose DNA jumps back to England, but it's really difficult to learn anything from his data. So here's what the groups look like. The guy with the data in the UK actually has them in England all the way until George Thomas, 1850 in New York. Okay? So you'd think we could make that jump back to Thomas, 1821 in England, but I haven't found good data. And I've sent emails back and forth, never get an answer on where's your data for this line. We know we're connected by DNA, but it's just not been useful. All right. Anyway, here's our line. John, Gideon, James. Joshua, no problem being connected to James. This is my DNA here. It's either to James or it's to this James, the stowaway James, all right? The stowaway James has to be a WEBB relative. And with DNA that close, it is not likely he really was a stowaway from England. Because if he was a stowaway from England, on the WEBB line that had stayed in England all those years, his DNA would drift a lot farther away from my DNA, okay? For example, it would look more like this line here, because he made the jump in maybe 1760. So here's what you're talking about. So his DNA would be farther away from me and would land more up in here if he really came from England. But because his DNA is so close, he is either a son of James, 1733, or some of Gideon's other sons, or Gideon, or from this, probably not even as far back as this John Webb line, because that would be enough time to have the DNA actually drift more than it is. So probably restricted. He's either a son of James, or he's a son of Gideon, or one of the sons of Gideon. So more work on that. The DNA is so close that the odds are this James is a son of this James. And our James is an early son of this James. So that would put our James as a grandson of James Sr. As a grandson, it really takes away a lot of the problems of what's he doing in the family. Well, he's a grandson. He may or may not have ever lived there. He could live there half his life or none of his life. Doesn't matter. You know, maybe first couple of years after he was born, he lived there until his dad could establish enough money to have a farm or something and a wife to support him. So we look at our James Webb again, and a lifeline. And there's errors in here. Don't worry about them. We're just in general looking at some timelines here. And let's just start at the back. You see his son Joshua, and that shows up. Okay, Joshua, born in Colchester. James Webb, 1733, would have been 42 years old when Joshua was born. Now, his wife, Elizabeth Douglas, is actually the same age as James, 1733. So, and theoretically, she's married at age 40 when he comes back from Nova Scotia with 3 little kids. And she's unmarried at age 40. Now, he knew her when they were kids. They grew up in the same town. They get married. It's very, very rare to have a kid after not being married. It's even more rare to have another one 2 years later called James. That's stretching the odds if you look out throughout history. Doesn't happen very often. So I looked at the timeline and said, how can I squeeze another James in here that would be the father of our James. Well, between the ages of 18 and 27, he could have had a son, James. Wife unknown. Dies in childbirth. He's got a kid. And he's, the first recorded marriage is to Elizabeth Welch up in Horton Township, Kings, Nova Scotia. He's 28 when he gets married to Elizabeth. But it doesn't mean he wasn't married earlier. We just don't have records. Okay? And so in 1773, when he's married to Elizabeth Douglas, the James X that possibly came in this time frame would have been between 13 and 22 years old. Now imagine, it was not unusual for women to die in childbirth, and usually a fairly quick remarriage if possible, to have someone to take care of whatever kids you already had. But it's not unusual for the kids from the new marriage to get way more attention than the kids that were from previous marriages. And a teenager is one of those sorts of things that was very common to be mistreated by a new wife who wants her children to enjoy whatever estate may be created, not the children of somebody earlier. So he's old enough to decide he doesn't want to put up with another stepmother. And when the family comes back from Nova Scotia, they land in Boston Harbor. Maybe that's where he says, Pops, you go ahead on to where, back to Colchester in Connecticut. I'm going to strike out and seek my fortune. Catch up with you later. Everybody's happy. The first thing he does is tell everybody he's a stowaway because there's a war going on. Maybe he didn't want to be conscripted. I don't know. You don't know his age. He could have been 13 to 22, okay? Now, the only thing I've got here is that the comment after he goes up and marries Elizabeth Welch. They came back just in time for the American Revolution. So here's the family coming back in a boat. And so they're there in Boston about the same time this fellow claims to have been a stowaway. And I think he was not a stowaway at all, but he got off the boat from Nova Scotia. Didn't want anybody to know anything about him. You don't have to serve in the war. You don't have to pick sides. He just did what he could. So now we'll look at our stowaway here. And we don't know when he's born. Now I've whittled it down a little bit based on some other things and said, well, between 1751 and 1760, could have been born Colchester, Connecticut. Unknown mother. 1777, birth of a child, R. James Webb, unknown mother. He would have been between 17 and 26. All right, so it's in the possible range, all right? It was possible for James Webb, 1733, to have a son, grow up and have another son, James, and quite a bit of years, plus or minus on that, and it still would have been possible. So that's a theory. It's not proven. But because the DNA is closer to this particular James Webb, that's why I'm probably going to go mess with the line. The nice thing to do is add another line that is just your preference. So when you go on and search for your family, you can find by preference what you're looking at, and you don't remove anybody else's wrong genealogy. Just leave it alone. Just create a second path. The problem is other people go in there, they see the second path, and they just break out in hives and try to remove it and mess it up. I wish they would just leave it alone. Mind your own business, okay? That's a good motto. Because we can both enjoy whatever line we think is right. And nobody has to worry about it. You just click on preferences. That's the way it should be done when you can't come to a conclusion otherwise. Okay, what I've constructed here is going back, starting at 1720. Every 10 years is a line, all right? This is back 1720, and we end up around 1820. So we have 100 years spread out here. We got three people we're following. James 1733, James the Stowaway, and James 1777. And initially, I'm only going to plot the proven stuff, okay? So let's look. We're going to blow up the top of this to look at it better here. All right. Let's follow James 1733. Born in Saybrook in the French and Indian Wars for 2 years. Now, it's not there now, but a long, long time ago, there were snippets that were just, you could see them there when you do a search. But they didn't have enough data to actually be useful, except they would say there's a marriage record of Elizabeth Toff, Connecticut, 1754. And there's also another one in 1755. One was Connecticut, one was Nova Scotia, and then later 1758 Nova Scotia. So we have the same Elizabeth Toff with 3 marriage dates to James Webb. Well, and the other information about it is so bad that it's not even there for anybody to bother anymore, but it used to be there a long time ago. We follow the blue. After the French and Indian War, goes to Boston. And now what's on? I have to go back, and I can't. Each inch is about 100 miles, all right? And so this is kind of a how many miles away, and then what time was it that he made a move? So he goes a couple 100 miles, 100 miles or 200 miles, and he gets to Boston. Then by ship to Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, it says Elizabeth Toff dies, possibly childbirth. So now there's a mystery, but they would have the possible birth is now between 1754 and 1757. In Nova Scotia, there are marriage records that he marries Elizabeth Welch. Okay, Elizabeth Toff shows up, but we don't know that she's married to our James Webb. It's just some James Webb, but I'm suspicious. He marries Elizabeth Welch. They have Bliss, Abigail, and Anne. Possibly at the birth of Anne, we have the death of Elizabeth Welch. Or a few months later. At any rate, at least by the end of 1768, our James Webb 1733 is in Nova Scotia with 3 small kids and possibly a teenager by an earlier marriage to take care of. And maybe he's not so much a teenager anymore. He could be a full adult if it was early before he got up to, Nova Scotia. So James goes back to Boston. then back over to Colchester and marries Elizabeth Douglas by 1773. And then Joshua is born 2 years later. Okay? Now we're going to hop over to James the Stowaway. He gets off a boat in Boston. And it's about the same time that the family has come back. And we don't see James 1777 yet. We'll see him on the next slide when we go look at what happens next. Okay. So you see Joshua. Now the stowaway claims to have been a stowaway from England, climbs a tree and watches Bunker Hill. That's 1775, same year that Joshua was born. And then Data has our James Webb born here, 1777. Here's the distance if it was Hartford. Here's the distance if it were Colchester. If it was Egremont, Egremont, Massachusetts, the distance would be here. Anyway, we'll hop back to Stowaway. He finds himself in Massachusetts. Egremont, Massachusetts has Leander, Roxana, Abigail, Orson. He then moves to Smithville, which is a town you can hit with a rock from Tyner. And he has other children in Smithville, the rest of them. And then Smithville, Tyner, Smithville, he's around those areas and has the rest of his kids. Now we hop to R. James Webb, 1777. Marries Betsy Favell in Brookfield. Brookfield, super close to Smithville. Okay? Kind of a longer distance away from Colchester. All right? And selling land in Otsego and going to Mannheim. He's not that much farther away from the family that I think he actually is from. So real quick, James Webb, 1777, Boston, Nova Scotia, back to Boston, ends up in Colchester. Our James Webb, first time we have documented evidence of him is hopping between A and D. We'll blow it up, all right? A and D is where he's between Brookfield and Otsego. Down here is Tyner. So the stowaway shows up in Egremont, Massachusetts. Oh, that's interesting. It's not really that far away from everybody else. In fact, it's kind of in between everything. And then he moves here. The same year, R. James shows up with land here. And that may explain a whole lot, because this is a long ways from the Colchester, East Haddam area, where most of them had land. After James is here, then either his brother Bliss or his nephew Bliss comes out and joins him, and then they're again together way out when he moved. Now there's one more piece of circumstantial evidence. I read where James 1755, that's our stowaway, and whether it's 1760, 1755, whatever. I'm just going to call it 1755 for a number. His first recorded son, Leander Webb, served in the War of 1812. So I looked up to see what I could find about this. See, Leander, who I believe to be a younger brother to James 1777, was a private, and P. Knapp was his paymaster. And as we'll see in a minute, this P. Knapp was Pardon Knapp. Where did Pardon Knapp Webb's name come from? James Webb told his family that he named all of the kids in his family for family or friends that he admired. I cannot find any Pardon Knapp that is a relative, so he must have been a friend. If I search for Pardon Knapp, I only find Pardon Knapp Webb. It's hard to find plain Pardon Knapp. Who was the Pardon Knapp that was a friend of James Webb? Pardon Knapp Webb's name? Well, although this record has Pardon discharged as a sergeant after the War of 1812, I find no other records. Pardon Knapp was born in 1818, and I believe James 1777 knew of Leander's good friendship, and possibly his life was saved by his sergeant. You see that Pardon Knapp, he's a paymaster, but he's also a sergeant. And so you're more likely to be real happy with your sergeant if he saves your life, you know. So here's some of the interesting names of James Webb children. 3 of his kids were Lorenzo Dow, Elijah Bailey, and James Wesley Webb. I looked for years and could not find anything about how did he know Lorenzo Dow. I didn't even know these people. And then in 1972, in the New York Public Library, I found a book. Dottie also found this in Dallas somewhere later on. But the book was called Organizing to Beat the Devil, a Story of Early Methodist Preachers. And all 3 of these guys were Methodist preachers in the New York area. They were circuit riders. And Lorenzo Dow was the most famous. These particular Methodist preachers were of the fire and brimstone type, very energetic on the platform when they preached, and they had huge crowds. Lorenzo Dow was such a famous preacher that almost all the women, their next son after they listened to him preach was named Lorenzo Dow. So you find Lorenzo Dow Webb, Lorenzo Dow Snow. There's even a Lorenzo Dow Young, one of Brigham Young's sons, because he was so famous. And by the way, if you're a Baptist, you wouldn't name your children after Methodist preachers. Now, later he has a kid named Sidney Rigdon Webb, and those that are LDS know where we'd get that name. So he's not a Methodist anymore. Now he's LDS. Chauncey Griswold's not a problem. That's his wife's father's name. But where in the world does Pardon Knapp name come from? Leander's sergeant in the War of 1812. Now, I didn't find that until I was in the Richardson Family Search Center in 2020 and got the War of 1812 records and found it. They also had lots of other Milos and Densmores, but I couldn't make the connection. But at any rate, that's the only history of Pardon Knapp, very small history. I think my James 1777 has to be the brother of Leander Webb, the older brother, okay? To have any idea of who Pardon Knapp is. Leander's 1812 information is all the information in the world about Pardon Knapp. If Leander is a second or third cousin, it doesn't seem likely that any detail would have ever been known to James Webb over in Hanover. That's way over on on the outskirts of New York, next to an Indian settlement. So I just don't see him knowing that unless he's worried about his little brother who's off fighting in the war. And that's why I'm going to put up a line that has our James Webb, now with a different father than normal, who would make James 1733 a grandfather instead of a father. It actually solves all the other why this and why that. To just have it all one happy, weird family.